welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin, and this is the programme where you can have all your property related questions answered by our team of experts. Now with me today is, by Zoom I will say, from Ipswich, John Howard, property developer, author, public speaker and estate agent. Welcome, John.
I'm not sure I'm an estate agent, but thank you very much indeed.
Well, I thought you had a number of estate agents.
We do, yes. I don't work in them, fortunately, for me.
Well, there you are then. Okay, and joining John is Trevor Leggett, founder of Leggett Immobilier, French real estate agents and property advisors. Welcome, Trevor.
Hi, Steve.
Good. Okay, well, let's get on with the first question. And the first question goes to John, which is, coming into winter, the housing market seems to be quite buoyant. This is quite surprising given all the current difficulties caused by the COVID pandemic. Do the panel think that the market will stay strong through the next year? And if so, what's your reasoning?
Well, we've all been surprised, Stephen, how strong the market's been since we came back from lockdown the first time. And of course, it was a pent-up demand, and also Rishi did us a great favour by introducing the stamp duty holiday. Now, that finishes in March the 31st, and I've just signed a petition that's going around saying it should be kept for another 6 months. Funny that. So, but at the moment, they are not going to do that. They are going to finish it. And if you remember, and you're both old enough to remember this, that in 1989, the then Chancellor, I think it was Lawson, decided to stop the double tax relief on mortgages. And they had a set date of when it finished. And there was a mad scramble for people to exchange complete before then. And once that had happened, the market dropped and we ended up in a recession. So I do hope this isn't going to happen this time. I don't think it will, but that's what happened last time when we had this hiatus and then you know, a deadline, and then nothing sells for 3-6 months hardly afterwards.
Do you not think a total rethink of how stamp duty is charged is needed?
Well, I know you've been and you've made great strides, Stephen, to say that I understand that stamp duty should be paid by the vendor, and I can understand that because the vendor has the money. When they complete a purchase, a sale, they normally have, you know, cash available, whereas a purchaser doesn't quite often. So I think maybe it should be paid for by the vendor. I agree with you, or maybe a mixture of the two. Or guess what? Let's scrap it all together because it's a tax on people. It discriminates people that wish to move around the country, and with unemployment as it's going to be, the one thing the government want to encourage is people to move around the country to find employment.
Well, yeah, John, but there's two things here. One is that moving these days, the in and out costs are so expensive with stamp duty, lawyers' fees, and all the rest of it. It's very difficult. It's not that easy. But you see, I do wonder. I mean, you're going to tell me off for being London-centric, but I'm thinking in London, there's many people sell their homes, make £1 million plus profit, and it's tax-free. Don't you think those days are over?
Well, I think in London it's going to get tougher in the next 18 year to 18 to 2 years. I think the market in London has gone down. Actually, I know people say it hasn't, and there's lots of activity, but I think they're wishful thinking. My view is the market's gone down, and what we're finding with our estate agency in Norfolk, Stephen, we're finding people who are moving out of London, who are taking big reductions on the price they wanted for their property.
Trevor, do you want to come in on this one? What do you think?
Well, you know, I'm not surprised that the market's picked up, and I agree with John. It is entirely, in my view, due to stamp duty. I think that, you know, the market was depressed before COVID. I don't think, you know, there was some pent-up demand, but I think it was more pent-up taxation. So I think the release of stamp duty has created it, and would have done with or without COVID. And it's proven so successful, the government surely can't go back to that. You know, I remember when stamp duty was 2 or 3% on the continent in most places. Now it's about 5% across the board. But you don't get this super stamp duty up, no. You know, there needs to be rethought. I think you're right. And just to see what's happened to the property market over the last 8 months is proof that what they've been doing didn't work.
You know, it gets to be a very complicated subject, because you hear a lot of complaint about the fact that in central London there are a lot of very expensive properties bought by overseas people, that they're empty, they're not being used. But frankly, you know, what's the problem?
I think the problem was, and I think I understand the problem was that a lot of these properties were bought in corporate structures, and when they transfer the shares later, it's very difficult to actually apply the stamp duty. So I think the thought track was, let's tax them once a huge amount of money if we can't get it off them again. Which, you know, really, there are ways of knowing who the beneficiaries of the companies are. We can find out with a little bit more, you know, it is possible. It's just harder. It's just a little bit harder. But by making a huge tax on expensive properties to compensate for what we're losing elsewhere is ridiculous.
But again, Trevor, it's very easy to actually cope with that, because like a lot of European countries, what we could do is insist very simply that any person buying a property in England, London, Manchester, wherever, has to appoint, if they're not UK citizens, has to appoint a responsible professional to manage the property. You do that, you appoint a firm of accountants, you almost create a new business in the process, and that person is as responsible as
Some
you.
accountability.
Yeah, for paying the various taxes. You know, but there we are. All right, Trevor, let's move on to your question. The deadline for completing Brexit is here. I've been thinking of buying a property in France, but have been waiting for clarification of any changes in either procedure or costs. Could the panel give a summary of any changes they anticipate?
Yeah, of course. Regarding purchasing a property, there are very little changes for UK as a European resident or a non-resident. But when it comes to selling a property for vendors, they will be treated like a non-EU citizen. So it means basically, as you quite rightly just pointed out, you have to have a body who represents you fiscally. So you need fiscal representation. What does that mean? That means that all your invoices have to be checked by somebody, and your calculation of the capital gains tax has to be underwritten by a third party. Right. And that is a French-based, what they call an organisme accrédité.
Okay.
That was for Americans, Australians, or anybody from outside the EU. That now applies to Brits. It's not a big deal. Anyone who owns a property, their principal residence in France, obviously when you buy your property, the stamp duty stays the same for everybody. There's no other difference. The only thing is obviously that if it's your personal home, as in the UK, you don't pay any tax at all on, or you don't pay capital gains tax on your main residence. So that's exactly the same. That doesn't change.
Okay.
So non-residents, will be non-resident, non-EU. That's the only thing that changes. We will possibly pay more capital gains tax because obviously there's going to be less things possibly you can deduct from the bill.
Right.
So it can be stricter.
I mean, do you think your customer base will feel any different about buying in France when we're separated?
Well, if the last 12 months has been anything to go by, I would say no, because frankly we've had a mini boom as well, mainly caused by French clients moving to the countryside, because a lot of people are moving from cities out to the countryside, as they have done in the UK, and you know that we've never done anything like it. The big problem at the moment is stock, because people aren't putting stuff on the market still. There's a little bit of uncertainty. People are waiting. We've got 4,000 less listings going into 2021 than we had going into 2020.
Crikey.
That's a big difference.
John, just on that subject of people moving out of big cities, you just referred to your agencies seeing a sort of a bit of an exodus from places like London to the countryside. Do you think that'll last?
Well, it's very interesting. We're pretty confident next year that we'll have a decent year, based really on the fact that we think more people will keep continuing this trend of moving out. But of course, someone's also buying the properties in these cities, enabling these people to move out. So it's a very, very interesting situation. I think certainly till March we'll be inundated, but after that we just have to wait and see. It does seem to me, though, that the wealthier people in this country, and by the way, there's 8.5 million people in this country with assets over £500,000. And that's what Rishi is looking to tax us on, assets over 500,000 to get over this COVID, which is very interesting. So I think the more wealthy people aren't having a problem. They're moving. They're moving. Perhaps they were going to move in 5 or 10 years' time anyway, and they've brought it forward. That's what they're doing, and I think that will continue for the time being going forward. And I'm sure Trevor, the same with you, Trevor, in France. I agree with you.
Well, we've had a wealth tax, John, for 30 years. We've had a wealth tax. I've been in France for 30 years, and we've always had a wealth tax. It's now a property wealth tax. It used to be on all of your assets.
Right.
But it's a very small amount of money. Nobody really notices it, to be honest. They make a bigger deal of it than it really is. It doesn't really hurt.
In the UK, Trevor, they're talking about a 1% one-off tax on assets of over 500,000, spread over 5 years. And that's what I think might well happen.
On that happy note, John, we're going to go to a break. So, Trevor, John, join me after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. With me is John Howard and Trevor Leggett. Welcome back, guys. John, your second question.
Yes.
The new planning regulations being brought in by government will allow a wider range of properties that can be converted to residential property. Although good for accommodation figures, will it add a further nail in the coffin of the high streets and community areas?
It totally will do, Stephen, but I'm afraid they're dead anyway. I mean, in the last 8 months, I think we've come forward 10 years, and any business that was struggling and going to collapse anyway has now collapsed or is about to collapse. You know, all the big stores, Debenhams and all the rest of it. So the government have looked at this and they've decided there's a new band called Band E for planning. And basically they've brought into Band E, or going to bring into Band E, children's nurseries, doctors' surgeries, all this type of commercial, semi-commercial activity. And they're all going to be in Band E, or we are in Band E. And Band E in July is going to be allowed under PD to change to residential. So it comes into force, I think, in July. At the moment, it's out for discussion, but I mean, there's not much to discuss about it. The government are going to do it, clearly. But very interesting, the white paper they brought out recently regarding building in the countryside, and they're going to build all these thousands and thousands more homes in the countryside. That's all been stopped by, funnily enough, the MPs in the countryside. The ones who have got constituencies in the countryside have said, we're not having that. And that's exactly what you and I spoke about, Stephen, probably 3 months ago, if you remember, on this show.
So, John, I'm guessing we're about to have our 12th housing minister in 10 years then.
Well, I've met quite a few of them, but I haven't met the last one. He's the MP for Tamworth. You could well be right. And if you remember, you know, we spoke about this 3 months ago. And the one thing that to remember is this year, they've only built 160,000 new houses. Their target was 300,000. And of course, they need to be building 500,000 houses. So in the long run, you know, the shortage of housing in the UK, it bodes well for the property developers and investors in the UK. Yes,
I suppose it does. Trevor, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I agree. I'm absolutely shocked at the amount of housing that's gone up in rural areas when, you know, in the 1980s, 90s, even the early 2000s, it was completely out of the question. And now we're seeing housing developments in the southeast with 3,000-4,000 homes on them.
Yeah.
I mean, even in what to me look like flood zones. Or very close to flood zones.
There's no sustainability to them. This is the problem. No sustainability at all.
No.
It doesn't seem like the best policy, but...
Well, it seems, again, along with stamp duty, it looks like we need a rethink of the whole system properly.
How much of the office space could be converted? The excess office space could be converted. Has anyone got any figures on it?
No, Trevor, I don't think there's any figures out
yet.
Yet. But what I would say, if you look at London, you know, there's going to be a wealth of vacant office space. Not straight away, because a lot of people will take, you know, companies take time to get out their leases. But I mean, there will be a lot of accommodation, which will be converted to residential, I'm sure. And I think a lot of these towns and cities will become more like city villages, where you have a lot more residential accommodation in them than you've ever had before. And I think it's also ideal for older people. And I think there's a market coming forward for perhaps older accommodation for older people, which is rental accommodation. So there's lots of different things happening. And of course, the government are very keen on brownfield sites. With brownfield sites, you don't need planning anymore as such. Everything is changing in front of our very eyes, I think. Really, it's very fast.
Oh, you'll be pleased to know that, you know, the individual building plots that we used to have thousands of years ago are no more. As the planning consent expires, because we've got the opposite problem, because people don't build on land, they'll get planning and then leave it there and keep it as an asset. Well, the planning expires and they're not being renewed. So lots of building land currently is getting lost because people have just been negligent. They've left it thinking, oh, it's just an asset, it's not a problem. We'll reapply for planning and get it automatically, and they're not getting it.
Is that happening here at all, John?
Well, I think the government are trying to force developers somehow to build on the land they've got planning for quicker. And I think there'll be penalties if you don't do so. So I think Trevor, eventually that's what's going to happen here, because, you know, people are buying plots and then renewing in 3 years' time, the planning.
They're just banking it, land banking.
That might change.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not sure I see the problem with land banking, really, in a way. Any company that is selling something has to have stock. And if you're a developer and you see a piece of land that might develop into something good, you might not have the funds, the wherewithal, the staff, the builders, whoever to do it now, but you would want to bank it, put it away for the future, would you not? Is that not just good company planning?
Well, I think you know, I think that's an old-fashioned attitude, Stephen, and probably you and I are on the same page on that one. But I think the modern way is very different, and I think, you know, we have to look towards the modern techniques. And, you know, there's lots of different ways now of developing and investing that we never had in 20, 30, 40 years ago, including, of course, modular homes, which can be built very quickly. So I think the whole thing is changing, and I think the government are slowly changing with it.
All right, thank you, John. Trevor, your second question. I understand that if I haven't become resident in France by the end of 2020, I will not have a right to lifelong health care. If simply through logistics I've missed that deadline, what will be the consequences of my healthcare situation?
Well, again, that's too early to tell, because we haven't got any clarity whatsoever for retired people, I guess you're saying. Because if you have a business in France, you move in, it doesn't matter if you're non-EU, so providing you can support yourself, providing you have a job to go to within a company, or you create a business which enables you to survive and you've got enough money, and let's put it in a nutshell, if you can support yourself, you'll get into the health system. If you can't, you won't, unless you're retired. I mean, but it's going to be the same as what it should, in my view, it should have always been like that. Well, and the idea of having people roaming around the continent with no money, I'm sorry, pouncing off of the state from one to the other, has never been a great idea in the first place.
Well, it would seem to be unsustainable, wouldn't it?
Yes.
But let's just take those two situations. Okay, so somebody during their working life is going to move to France. So have they got to try and beat this deadline of the end of the year, or?
No. To be frank, I mean, I've been saying all along that it's not going to change an awful lot. Unfortunately, the government have had on their website that if you get in before the end of the year, it will be less complex, mainly because they don't know what's going to happen afterwards. But I mean, I can only go by Australian, South African or Canadian clients that we have. None of them have a problem getting into the French health system. None of them have a problem. It's a little bit more long-winded. Providing you've got enough money to support yourself, you will get residency. Of course, if you're a European before, you didn't need to prove anything. No. You could just rock up and, you know, that was that, as we obviously know here in the UK.
Okay. So if you're retired, how would that situation change?
If you're retired, the moment you could have just literally joined the CMU, you could have gone straight into the French system. But again, it was never that simple either. You still have to prove where your revenue came from.
Right.
There was a reciprocal health arrangement, which I think will probably be maintained between France and the UK, although it's up to them to agree to that, which is nothing to do with the European Union anyway. There's a double taxation agreement, which has got nothing to do with the EU either. There were arrangements between France and the UK that were prior and separate arrangements from the EU anyway.
Right.
Of course, it was simpler within the EU because you could literally go wherever you want, wherever you wanted, without being a resident. Now, if you want to be a resident, it's not a problem. The problem will be for people with holiday homes. At the moment, as it stands, with a holiday home, you'll only be able to stay out there for 3 months.
Right.
I can't see that they're going to do it. The French are going to make some sort of a ménagement, as they say, because they can't. You know, in a lot of areas, these people go and spend 182 days a year they were allowed to spend in their summer homes and remain fiscally domiciled in the UK.
Okay.
I mean, they will still want to remain fiscally domiciled in the UK, and they'll only be able to spend 90 days in only one broken period. That we know for the moment, but I think that will change, and they'll be able to get like a long visa. There'll be a different visa that'll enable them to stay a bit longer.
And I'm guessing for somebody who's retired, then the simple answer would be to look at healthcare insurance and cost that into your living budget.
Everybody in France is insured anyway. It's part of our health system. We all have private care, so we all have a top-up system. So we pay into the national insurance system, and then we all have different levels of top-up.
Okay.
So, for dental care, for example, you'll have 200% of what the state give you on top in your insurance policy will enable you to get better dental care than the standard dental care that's available from the state.
Right.
So we're used to it, and I think everybody is. And there's lots of companies out there who have already got packages in place for Brits when they leave the European Union. It's all dealt with, it's ready to go.
Okay. Well, that's good news, isn't it?
Don't worry, it's not
That's great news. John, I'm guessing you haven't got much to add to that. That's not really your subject.
Trevor's the expert on that. Clearly, he knows what's going on. I'm glad something's organised for when we leave the EU.
Yeah, well, at least our end is organised, John, if your end isn't.
We've got a lot more to organise than you.
Yeah, granted.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. That's the end of the show. So Trevor Leggett, John Howard, thank you both very much for contributing. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me next time on Property Question Time.